Good afternoon and welcome to Full Scottish here in Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Donald C Stewart and I am joined today by two guests. Firstly, from wet and windy Aberdeenshire, Kenny Anderson. Kenny, it is great to see you.
Morning. Yeah, it's certainly soggy in Aberdeenshire, but the sun is now out, so hopefully things will dry up a little bit fairly quickly. But there's quite a lot of damage and one or two tragedies to deal with in the coming days.
Indeed, Kenny. And also, we go from one end of the United Kingdom down to our partners down in Wales, and Hugh Edwards is with us. Hugh, you were saying just there as well, the rain has touched the sunny climes of Wales as well.
It has. I think you can see the where I've just been caught out trying to bring the laundry in. It's been bright and sunny, and then the rain came, but obviously we haven't had as much rain as you've had up there in Scotland. Thoughts with a family who've lost people during the storms.
And indeed, thoughts are with all families, not only here but abroad, and we start often, as we always do, with the Ukraine update on day 270. Rishi Sunak, Prime Minister, made a surprise visit to Kyiv on Saturday to meet Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, his first visit to Ukraine since taking office. Mr Sunak announced that the United Kingdom will provide a £50 million air defence package for Ukraine, including anti-aircraft guns and technology to counter Iranian-supplied drones. The Ukrainian Prosecutor General's office said at least 437 Ukrainian children have been killed and more than 837 injured as a result of Russia's invasion. 5 people were injured in a Russian strike on a humanitarian station in southern Ukraine, said Kyrylo Tymoshenko, a senior aide to President Zelensky. About 60 Russian soldiers were killed in a long-range Ukrainian artillery attack this week, Kyiv said on Saturday. In a Facebook post, the Armed Forces General Staff said Russia suffered the losses on Thursday when Ukrainian forces shelled the town of Mykolaiv, 40 kilometres south of Kherson. Russian forces abandoned the city, of course, earlier this month. It has also been reported that Kyiv is in a critical situation with power shortages and hour-long blackouts, according to officials, amid Russian attacks on their energy infrastructure. But the Energy Ministry said on Saturday that Ukrainian electricity supplies were under control and there was no need to panic. President Zelensky said that the supply problems were worst in and around Kyiv, as well as in 6 other regions. Ukraine's Deputy Defence Minister, Volodymyr Havrilov, has said Ukrainian forces could be in Crimea by the end of December. The UK Ministry of Defence has released its latest intelligence update on the war in Ukraine, and Russia has made its largest single-day issuance of debt in history on Wednesday. Moscow had not officially contacted Kyiv about peace negotiations, but Russia would have to completely withdraw its forces for talk to take place, said Andriy Yermak, the Ukrainian presidential chief of staff. The first passenger train to the recently liberated Kherson city arrived from Kyiv for the first time since Russian troops occupied the southern Ukrainian city. And the funeral took place on Saturday of a Polish man. There was one of 2 victims killed when a missile crashed into a grain storage facility in the Polish village of Perjewodow. US Defence Secretary Lloyd Austin said China and Russia were seeking a world where force is used to resolve disputes, and he vowed the United States would continue to defend humanitarian principles and international laws. Asia-Pacific leaders added their voices on Saturday to international pressure on Russia over its invasion of Ukraine, issuing a summit statement saying most of them condemned the war. Kenny, if I can come to you, Ukraine is a daily update, obviously, we have here, but it's a humanitarian crisis that doors are being opened across the world to try and allow those who are fleeing from conflict to come in. It's certainly something that we in Scotland have attempted to open our minds, our hearts and our doors to.
Yeah, I believe that of the UK incoming refugees from Ukraine, then Scotland's taken more than its percentage population share. And I'm hearing and seeing stories of people that are integrating well and speedily into Scottish society, kids going to school. My own football team, Dundee United, have signed a 12-year-old Ukrainian who's very promising. So there's heartening stories, but there's obviously a lot of work to be done, and obviously some of the refugees are still in highly temporary accommodation. And I'm not sure how far advanced the planning is to fully integrate all of these people into normal housing stock and so forth. But obviously that provides a series of problems in itself. But hopefully that can move forward and we can be seen to be welcoming and involving everybody in our society. And then in the rebuild back, when hopefully some sort of settlement is agreed, then the build back of Ukraine and the allowing people to go back to their homes and rebuild their society can happen. But they'll want a degree of stability and faith that the same thing won't happen again come the summer.
Absolutely. And Hugh, in terms of stability, one of the things that any Ukrainian or anybody fleeing conflict wants is to go back to a place where there is some kind of settlement negotiated or otherwise. And the hope for the West, I suppose, would be that we manage to do that with Russia back within its borders.
Yeah, but it's unfortunately with Vladimir Putin, it's a big ask because Russia is fundamentally a dictatorship. Putin controls the media and controls the narrative there. I've got friends who I got a friend who was in Russia at the time of the invasion and has managed to come home to Wales, and his Russian wife has managed to follow him. So he's still in touch with what's going on in Russia. And the people there, although there are a few people, there are many people who are opposed to the war. The propaganda message is still going through that they're being there to liberate Ukraine and that it's a fascist regime and all that stuff. But it's interesting in Wales because we actually have a government minister who is Ukrainian, Mick Antoniou, who is the Counsel General, I think. I don't know, basically the legal representative of Welsh government. He was actually born in the Ukraine and moved here as a child. So so the awareness around that is around what's happening in Ukraine. He's visited, but he actually sort of brings updates because obviously he still has family and stuff there. But yeah, we're hoping for a settlement, but I think it's going to take time. We just need to keep supporting Ukraine in their efforts. Because the only thing that's going to sort of end this, unfortunately, is that Russia, finally withdraw, run out of weapons or whatever, and give up.
Absolutely. And of course, here at Broadcasting Scotland, we will continue to bring our daily updates. But this week, the major news has been dominated, of course, by the autumn statement, where Chancellor Jeremy Hunt's autumn statement, where people were waiting to see how far the quasi-Kwarteng budget would be rolled back, where he revealed that there shall be tax rises now and spending cuts coming after the next general election. And Kenny, if I could come back to you, the question that some people have been asking is, has the Chancellor created a trap for the Labour Party at the next general election, where this is going to be the major focus of questions posed for them?
I think he has. I mean, I think the purpose of the statement and the budget was to calm the markets, which appear on the face of it to that objective has been achieved. But by sleight of hand, obviously the key cuts are not going to apply until after the next election, which allows the Conservatives to create a narrative, a false narrative, and it'll be very, very difficult for Labour. I mean, there was rumours that when the Conservatives took over from Labour that somebody left a note saying there's no money left, but I think that's going to be even more the case on this occasion. I don't really see where there is room, unless there's innovative new ideas, similar to, perhaps Alex Neil, the former SNP minister, has talked about a levy on land ownership if you own more than a certain number of acres, there's a levy, and obviously there'd have to be exemptions for farmers, but large estates might get levied. So maybe some innovative tax raising, some reform of tax, a more progressive tax across the UK, similar to what Scotland has moved towards, might help. But there's going to be very little wriggle room, I would have thought, for an incoming Labour government if they win. But I mean, I would have thought Jeremy Hunt will be doing everything in his power to create a narrative that would allow the Conservatives a chance to get back in yet again, which is disastrous for everyone.
Indeed. And Hugh, I have to say I found it absolutely astonishing. We had a 44-day premiership slagging off the previous Conservative Party, Conservative governments, to be followed by the Chancellor she appointed then ripping up her economic policies, and now embarking on, from within the context of a Conservative administration, something that seems to either be dodging bullets or dodging responsibilities.
Yeah, I think it's one of the one of the great successes of the Conservative Party over the last sort of couple of years is the way they've managed to manipulate the media to present every new incarnation as some sort of new form of government, and trying to get the public to forget that they've actually been there for 12 years now in charge of things. And I think one of the big issues is just economic policy. I'm not an economist, but I'm interested in the field, and I think Labour's biggest weaknesses is that they're a pale blue version of the Conservatives when it comes to economics. So when it comes to the next general election, the likelihood is Labour should win based on how awful, not based on how good they are, but based on how awful the Conservatives have been over the last 2 years. But I can't see there's no sort of interesting thinking coming from within the party, because they just seem to be sort of copying, aping what Hunt is suggesting. And I think with the Barnett formula, I think Scotland's had 1.5 billion, Wales has got to like 1.2 billion. But with the cost of inflation, it's not it's a real terms cut to budgets, and where it's going to really feel the impact is local authorities, and the money that they have to spend on services in communities.
And it's not often I feel some sort of sympathy for the English in terms of the context of politics, but certainly within both Wales and Scotland, there are alternatives to the Conservative Party and indeed to the Labour Party that don't seem to be available in England. So one wonders, you referred there to the Labour Party often following in the clothes discarded by the Conservative Party. You have to wonder where this majority may actually come from.
Well, it's interesting from a Wales perspective, because obviously we've had a Labour government in the Senedd in Cardiff since its inception. There's been power sharing with Plaid Cymru, and during this term, they're not power sharing, but they've done a cooperative agreement, which is, compared with Labour in England, far more progressive. I think Labour in Wales are more progressive, but I think it's the fact that they're working in partnership with Plaid Cymru, that the progressiveness is coming through. And I think Keir Starmer, rather foolishly and undemocratically, has ruled out, sort of discussing any sort of power sharing or discussions with the SNP should they come into power. But it's an interesting dynamic, because obviously, the Labour in Scotland, continually point to SNP bad, whereas some of the issues around, health, the health service in Wales, the waiting lists are worse than anywhere in the UK, and that's under the Labour administration. And I think that's something that Starmer conveniently forgets when he's having a go at the SNP in Scotland, is that many of the issues that the SNP are facing are the ones that his own party are in charge of in Wales and aren't dealing with very well. But that also comes down to the fact that in Wales, more so than in Scotland, it's basically an administration administering on behalf of whichever party is in power in Westminster. They receive money that they can spend on health and education, but they don't decide the level of the spending. They're given a sum and they have to spend that, and obviously that sum is never enough.
Well, interestingly, Hugh, the autumn statement was supposed to be designed to deal with the emerging and very present economic crisis which we have in the UK whilst it's in recession. Inflation is at 11.1%. The energy cap increased to £3,000 is not until April 2023 next year, and wages are falling in real terms. Kenny, has the British government done enough to support those in need? And I suppose part of that question which is begged is the £1.5 billion extra for Scotland. Is that enough to offset the effect of inflation on the Scottish Government's budget?
Well, to answer the first part of your question is no, they haven't done enough to protect ordinary people. And two, the 1.5 billion isn't nearly enough to deal with the pressures of inflation and wage rise, genuinely required wage rises, because there's been a fundamental freeze across most industries in the public sector for the last 3-4 years. So no, it's a major problem. It's very interesting as well, obviously, that in Scotland we're continually told by unionists that we have a deficit, that we are we have too large a deficit to consider independence, and yet the Chancellor is raising 54 billion over the next 4 years from the energy industry, a large part of which is based in Scotland. Not all of it, but that would more than deal with the deficits that the unionists churn out on the basis of GERS figures. So I think the Conservative government is only working in its own interests. It's the interests of re-election and feathering their own nests. I think the problem, and we're coming on to the cost of living crisis, but I mean, perhaps the lowest paid are not going to be taxed more, but they're having to deal with fundamental inflationary pressures on energy and on food and on fuel for their vehicles, etc., etc. So there's going to be real hardship, and nothing that this Conservative government does looks as if it will do anything to alleviate that. The Scottish Government last week released the additional child care payments, which will help some of the vulnerable. And if only the Scottish Government could do more. But like Hugh has talked about Wales, we don't have all the levers that are necessary to make a necessary adjustment. If we did, more could be done, and more could be done very quickly.
Of course, Hugh, we were told in the referendum in 2014 by unionists that we were better together. Given the policies from the Conservative government in Westminster, are Wales feeling the love as obviously as we are?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Support for independence in Wales is at an all-time high. Certain polls now put it at between 25 and 30%, whereas you go back, when I was younger, it was always around 10%, and it was just that that rump of, I suppose, Plaid Cymru and nationalist supporters who supported independence. I think the narrative now, the challenge is around the economics, because obviously with the UK economy in such a dire state, it's now been used as an example of why Wales can't be independent. Is if the UK can't be successful economically, how can Wales? Well, you just need to point at all the other smaller nations and countries around the world who aren't suffering as badly and haven't shot themselves in the foot by voting for Brexit. And Wales, sadly, did vote by a very narrow majority. I think it was 80,000 was the majority that voted for Brexit. But I think, if you ask those people now that they know, the truth of what Brexit was going to cause economically, I think you'd find that vote would be very different, because people basically in Wales, a lot of people I know in Wales voted just because of immigration. that was the sole reason. The sovereignty, protect our borders, and as it's been shown, it's A, that it's nonsense, and B, that we're actually suffering as a consequence because we haven't got enough people to do the jobs within our economy. So, yeah, I think the longer these things go on, then the case for independence can be made. But personally, I think Wales as an independent nation within the EU would be far better than just being independent by ourselves.
Kenny, I think, given what you were saying there, I think it's very important to reflect upon the fact that people who voted for Brexit, very many of them seem to have found a button on their conscience that says, I might have been wrong, but we don't seem to be able to find a reset button within certain political parties that said, well, we're now going to go and correct that. And there are certainly a number of politicians, Labour and Liberal Democrats come to mind more than others, who say we are now committed to make this work. Will it ever work?
I don't think it ever will work. One hopes that some of these Liberal and Labour politicians, and even some people in the sort of more moderate wing of the Conservative Party, would at least consider the single market and perhaps a Norwegian-Swiss model for operating with the EU. But I hesitate to attack the mainstream media, but there's an inability by the mainstream media, particularly television and radio, to address the issues of the problems that are being created in the UK as a result directly of Brexit, and of course in Northern Ireland as a direct result of Brexit. All of these could be solved if we were in the single market. But there seems to, the premise at the referendum was never for this hard Brexit. It was never mentioned, and yet we've ended up with this hard Brexit, which is so damaging. I really don't understand, particularly Liberal politicians, because I would have thought there's votes to pick up in England, because it looks like the opinion polls are suggesting that as many as 57% of the UK population would now vote to go back into the EU, or given the chance again, would vote Remain. I'd have thought that would be an electoral asset in an election to the Liberal Democrats, even if it's perhaps not to Labour, because the northeast of England seems to be stubbornly pro-Brexit. But it just beggars belief. I mean, if you were only interested in UK politics as opposed to the politics of independence for Scotland and Wales, and perhaps the consideration of a united Ireland, if you were only interested in UK politics, it seems insane to be anything other than pro rejoining the EU.
Well, Kenny, you seem to be reticent about attacking mainstream media. Hugh, you alluded earlier on to perhaps the mainstream media weren't doing their job. Are they holding this government's feet to the fire? Are they holding people to account? Are they actually giving us the facts, the figures to make up our own mind?
Well, clearly not. The issue we have in the UK, in Wales, Scotland, from a media perspective is, the news organisations, they are, they're politically leaning in, in whatever direction, and I think Scotland is unique that obviously with the National there, at least they've got one voice that's supporting independence, the SNP. But even I think it was the Daily Record supported the Greens at the last election, if I recall. And I think that's the issue. The majority of the papers and the press, the Mail, the Express, the Telegraph, the Times, they are basically mouthpieces for whatever conservative doctrines are out there. And then you've got the Mirror, on the other hand, and the Guardian that supposedly oppose that. And I think from a TV news, obviously, if you look at the Ofcom reports, the majority of people get the news from the BBC. The BBC is supposed to be objective and balanced, but we know from, we see it from ourselves, from a reporting perspective, how often is Brexit actually mentioned as an economic factor, and it seems to be sort of brushed under the carpet. And you go on social media, and you see interviews on TV, on the BBC, and Brexit isn't mentioned, and it's clear that it is. That it's not the only reason, but it's a major reason why the economy in the UK is falling behind other countries. And I don't know if you saw, there was a Conservative MP caught out on BBC, sort of just saying that the UK is doing better than X, Y, and Z countries, and even after being shown a graph showing that wasn't the truth, was still sort of following that line. And these people need to be called out more, because they are basically lying. And there's nothing wrong with journalists pointing out to the audience that if somebody said something that patently isn't true, that it isn't true. And I think a lot of that kind of stuff goes unchallenged.
Well, if it was unsurprising what Jeremy Hunt had to say in his statement, we shall all be in tenterhooks in Scotland this week over the Supreme Court's announcement on its judgment on the Lord Advocate's reference around the Scottish Government's intention to hold an independence referendum in October 2023. We all know that whether they allow a referendum or not, the decision will have a massive impact on Scotland's constitutional position within the United Kingdom. Well, with a Scot and a Welshman, perhaps that is a question that has twice the significance today. And Hugh, if I can come to you first, because I think we all are sitting here desperate to find out what the decision or what the advice shall be. From a Welsh perspective, I presume that you're all looking on with eagerness to see what way that perhaps can be swayed in terms of a Welsh context.
Yeah, I think it's something, it is a bizarre situation where, again, you have to seek permission to do something, in your own country. And I think that the big issue for me in the UK is if you look at the way that the UK is made up, and people forget this, that 83% of the population lives in England. I think it's 8% in Scotland and 5% in Wales, with the rest in Northern Ireland. And this is a problem where you've got a system of governance where basically 83% of the population are in one country and they decide what happens in the other countries. Then it is an issue. So I think, again, the legal route, I've been following some of it, and obviously I think, you know more than I do, and, there are people saying, which way will it go, that that they're not sure. But I think at the end of the day, if they do say that it is legal, then great, you should go ahead. If they say that it's not legal, as has happened in sort of Catalonia, then they're creating a rod for their own back, because if it'll obviously be an advisory vote if Nicola Sturgeon goes ahead and has that vote. But then obviously, if you then get a mass public sort of support for independence, then it's difficult for Westminster not to listen. But as I say, you're likely going to have a Labour government after the next election, which will come soon after the referendum in 2023. I think January is the date. I think the saying for the next general election, January 24. And I think just the fact that Labour are a unionist party, and they almost they're obsessed with unionism over what's better for Wales and Scotland, unfortunately. So it'll be interesting times, but yeah, so looking forward to Wednesday to see what the outcome is.
And I suppose, Kenny, the question that we in Scotland have to answer is what happens if they say gonna no do that, and we are left with the midpoint of you're not allowed, or we don't know if you're not allowed, or you are allowed. We're hopeful that they say carry on, October is yours. But what happens if it doesn't go the way that the SNP hope?
Well, I used to play a bit of chess when I was at school, and I wasn't particularly good, but I wasn't bad, and still occasionally play chess. And I believe all politicians should have a degree of skill at playing chess, because it's all about knowing what the opponent's options are 4 moves 6 moves, 8 moves down the line. I mean, there was a good piece in the Herald on Sunday today, an opinion piece about what was the likely outcome, and the fact that the decision has been announced earlier than it had originally been expected seems to suggest that the judges in the Supreme Court are unanimous in whatever they've decided. Whether you can draw any conclusions from that or not, I don't know, but I think whatever the outcome is, I think Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP's approach to this has been quite ingenious, because whatever the outcome, it's going to be a useful tool to demonstrate what happens next in the debate. I mean, if there is no obvious democratic route to independence or to the people of Scotland deciding their future, what does that say about the UK in the 21st century? It's nonsensical. And, you know, we sign up to United Nations, we deplore other countries that deny democratic rights. If there's a clear-cut democratic wish for a change, then that change should happen, and there should be a vehicle within the Constitution that allows it to happen. So I think whatever the outcome on Wednesday, it's going to be interesting for the independence debate. And I think it'll probably rattle it up, move the pieces around, and I think a path will become clear after this Supreme Court, whatever the judgment is.
Certainly. And Hugh, I suppose from a sort of Welsh perspective as well, if Scotland was to be given that opportunity to revisit the independence referendum, Wales, I suppose, we think of as being slightly behind the game in comparison to Scotland, perhaps even behind the game now with the population change and shift in Northern Ireland. How much of a boost would that give to those within Wales who believe in independence for the Welsh nation?
Well, you know, it would be, it would have significant impact. And I think what's interesting here, again, is that dynamic of Welsh Labour as opposed to how Labour look at independence in Scotland and England. You know, there is a group that's growing in support in Wales, Labour for Indy. You can check them out on Twitter, on social media. So there are voices within the Labour Party in Wales who support independence. You know, they've got elected councillors, and they had people on the lists as Labour candidates at the last election. So I think there's a movement within Labour in Wales to realise that that, you know, post-independence, you're likely to have a Labour government, you know, in power in Wales. And, you know, it comes down to the fundamental idea that, you know, the people of Wales should be deciding who governs them, not, you know, hoping that the 83% who live in England decide every now and again to vote Labour. And I think going back on the other point, you know, discussing things like Brexit, I think it's important that, you know, to campaign on those things. But, you know, and I can imagine, you know, sort of in Wales that the Labour Party would be far more open. You know, we've got members of, you know, of the Senedd. Alan Davis is one who is very openly and, you know, vociferous about, you know, wanting Wales to be, you know, within the EU and, you know, through the UK. And you know, I think there's a different dynamic here in Wales. And I think I think what Labour realises, that as opposed to what's happened in Scotland with the SNP, where the SNP drove that through, I think Labour are coming around to the idea of basically parking their tanks on Plaid Cymru's lawn and saying, well, you know, if we support independence, and if independence becomes, you know, more popular, and again, you look at the polling, you know, there is a majority who support independence as you go down the, you know, the age range. You know, it's older people who tend to be, you know, more pro the union. So, you know, it is going to happen. You know, it's this direction of travel, because obviously, you know, younger people as they get older, this new generation are far more clued up with what's going on in the world. And, you know, hopefully, you know, that'll make a difference. But I think it's an interesting dynamic, and I don't think it's discussed enough, is the difference between Labour in Wales and Labour in England, and especially Labour in Scotland.
Well, it's interesting, Hugh, because we hear a lot about splits within the Conservative government and the Conservative Party over direction of travel economically, Kwasi Kwarteng versus Jeremy Hunt, and so on. The Labour Party has obviously had the Corbynites, and Starmer seems to have done a great deal to start to weed them out and put them on the periphery. To find that there's a part of the United Kingdom Labour movement which is not just abandoning the principles of the working class struggle that it was founded upon in other parts of the country, but also willing to be part of an independence movement. One would presume, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt, that that's done with great belief in their heart. But is it something that's going to end up with them trying to steal the clothes and not deliver in a way that in the last few decades it could be argued that the Labour Party have talked a lot and delivered very little in terms of their opposition to the Conservative government?
Yeah, well, I think if you look at the Blair government, and obviously Blair, in fairness, that's what gave devolution and allowed that to happen. But there was so much during that government that they could have done, and it sort of irks me when Gordon Brown is wheeled out every now and again as some sort of, the voice of reason and the voice of sense that should be, sort of listened to when you think about how he was central to the Better Together and, and the promises that were made during that campaign that, you look at them now, you'd have to question what the logic behind those were. But, again, you look at Wales, Mark Drake, the First Minister, was a Corbyn supporter. He comes from a very different direction of thinking compared with Keir Starmer. But again, it's this dynamic of Labour within UK Labour, and I think that a lot of people would like to see Labour split from the UK Labour and become their own independent party within Wales. But that's something that obviously has been discussed, within their members. But it all comes down to how they fare at the ballot box. And I think what will happen at the next general election is Labour will do very, very well. And again, not necessarily because of what Labour are offering to the voters, but just how unpopular the Conservatives are. And when you get an unpopular Conservative government, Labour does well in Wales and Plaid Cymru doesn't, because Labour hoover up all the votes. And I can see why people would be. You look at places like Wrexham and Ynys who've had Conservative MPs who both been, they haven't been, great. And a lot of the new intake Conservative MPs, Bob Roberts in Delyn, who's been suspended for a while and is back in the party now, I think, that they haven't actually, covered themselves in glory. And I think that's what Starmer is trying to do, is just trying to make sure that he can win back those seats, that, the red wall seats, of some of which were in the north in Wales. And I think, unfortunately, that's where his priority is, rather than thinking about, taking the Welsh valleys where, 2/3 of the Welsh population live, and just taking that vote for granted.
Right, Kenny, well, you heard it here first. Gordon Brown, the voice of reason, brought out in order to prove to all of us that somehow the Labour Party have us at their heart. It's certainly, if there's movement within the Labour Party and within the United Kingdom, what does that mean for the Labour Party in Scotland? Because they quite clearly don't want to be away from the Labour Party in England, it would appear, but also seem to be struggling with just exactly what it is they're going to do in order to provide the seats that are going to provide a Labour government.
I think Labour in Scotland are frozen. They've got a single MP, Ian Murray, for Edinburgh South, who I know for a fact is considered a very good constituency MP. But as far as constitutional matters is concerned, he's stuck way back in the old Labour when it was the feeble 50. I've spoken on a couple of platforms at the same time as Brian Wilson, and I bumped into Brian Wilson 2 weeks ago at Heathrow, and we had a chat, and I wasn't sure if he remembered me, but I reminded him that I was from the opposite side. But we had a pleasant chat, but I think there's a deep hatred within parts of the Labour Party, of the independence movement and the SNP, which is a dreadful shame, because it would be a powerful lobby together if the reasonable people who support Labour and who support the original ethos of the Labour Party accepted and adopted, at least in part, independence as being a good way forward. I mean, you're often told, Liverpool workers are exactly the same as Glasgow workers, and why should we abandon them? But I think an independent Scotland would help those Liverpool workers and workers across England to see a more progressive government in an alternative way. So I can't see Labour in Scotland changing. Whether or not they pick up 1 or 2 MPs or 1 or 2 MSPs at each election, I don't see that changing. I think the Scottish National Party have got to guard against falling into the ways that the Labour Party did in the 1970s and 80s, and taking certain seats for granted and losing focus. There's been a lot of talk about how effective the SNP MPs are in Westminster. And I think after Wednesday with the Supreme Court, there should be a refocus. This is not a criticism of the leadership in any way, shape or form, but I think there has to be a dynamic approach to bring the argument out into the open and progress that argument at all times.
And from progress being stymied or stifled within the United Kingdom, we have heard this week as well, in fact this weekend, that there has been some progress at COP27 internationally, and following an early announcement from the Scottish Government, of course, the COP27 are talking of making their own contribution in Egypt to a historic loss and damage fund to compensate developing countries for climate impacts. This was a cause, as I said, championed by the Scottish Government and indeed by the First Minister who visited there. Is there light now that Glasgow shall not be forgotten, Kenny? Are we looking at an environmental deal that is somehow going to help the poorest nations in a way that was hoped for just that short year ago?
Well, I think the financial package that's been put forward can help, but it's like any other fund. How's it going to be used? How's it going to be administered? How's it going to be effective? And obviously there's been a bit of backsliding in terms of reducing world temperatures, in terms of greenhouse gases, in terms of carbon future and so forth. I do worry that COP27 has been a bit of a cop-out. There was more hope in the wake of Glasgow, I felt. There's a war waging in Europe and in other parts of the world that creates pollution in itself. Are we going to be spending money building flood barriers to help poor countries, or are we actually going to be doing something tangible? I mean, we alluded to it earlier, where we've got air-conditioned football stadiums in one of the hottest countries in the world. I mean, how crazy is that? You go to Edinburgh Festival in the summertime and there's patio heaters in outdoor spaces at every venue. You go to ski resorts and there's patio heaters and terraces. And yet we're trying to improve insulation standards and better building standards. And yet we do these daftest of things. We're talking about battery-operated cars, but then you look at the quarrying that takes place to create lithium batteries. Huge, great big diesel-powered excavators digging out vast amounts of rock. There are so many areas that we could improve upon without suffering economic decline. And I think that's what's got to be grasped harder. So I have to say, overall, apart from that fund, I'm pretty disappointed with COP27.
I suppose, Hugh, judging from afar, it does seem to have been a particularly huge letdown. Perhaps if they'd had it in Cardiff or Wrexham, it would have been a greater success in the way that it was in Glasgow just a year ago.
Yeah, I know that it's important for people to travel to these events. But I think the pandemic has shown that we can interact digitally. We're taking part in the conversation today from different parts of Wales and Scotland. It's just such an important matter, and it just still doesn't seem to be resonating with people. We saw, at least with the Sunak government, compared with Truss, who basically just she looked as though she's going to roll everything back, bring back coal mining, the works. But it's a serious issue. We're still not taking it seriously enough. The one good thing, to see, you look at the economic plans of Labour and Plaid Cymru, and I assume the SNP the same, is, trying to develop green energies, because one thing Wales and Scotland has, we've got waves offshore, we've got wind offshore, we've got wind inland. So the sun may shine a little bit more here in Wales than it does in Scotland. But, we've got the means to generate electricity. Wales generates far more electricity than it actually uses. And yet we have some of the highest energy bills in the UK. But, we don't need to, we need to remember as well in Wales that the majority of that power doesn't come from, wind and from renewables. It comes from gas. We've got a big gas powered power station in the south west, I think it is. And we're importing a lot of gas. And I just find it really bizarre that there are still elements of Russian gas coming into the EU whilst there's a war on. I just can't imagine there being any kind of trade with Germany during the Second World War for oil or something, for example. It's utterly bizarre, but it's really important. How do we get it to the top of the agenda? I think young people do see it as one of the most, if not the most important thing. And you see, what people, like protesters with Just Stop Oil, whether you agree with their methods or not, they're making a really important point, and at least they're getting people to talk about it.
I suppose, Kenny, just as both you and Hugh have alluded to, there is, it's only so long before the irony of doing something that makes something else worse can continue before it starts to affect everything. And Hugh suggesting that, of course, sun shines more in Wales than Scotland is perhaps a tough one to take. But, we were talking earlier on about the weather. We're talking about real things happening really now, and not much movement, or indeed, as a 19-year-old activist from the north of Europe said, it's all blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, the problem for me is that the tipping points have been reached. I've seen glaciers in France and Switzerland that have shrunk dramatically. If you go to Chamonix, there's a Victorian railway station where it used to take the Victorians to the top of the glacier. Well, they built a gondola from that down in 1985 to the top of the ice. And now the ice has shrunk back in 30 odd years, the same amount as it had shrunk about 150 years. And that's all down to global temperatures. Hugh was talking about Wales. I was looking up some statistics with regard to hydroelectric, which is a great way to store wind energy without using batteries. And I was quite pleasantly surprised by how amazingly strong Welsh hydropower is. I in my head, assumed that Scottish hydropower was far greater, but Welsh hydropower is pretty massive, and it's a great example. But we have to be able to harness, wind, sun, waves. What else? Well, I'm looking out the window, by the way, Hugh. It is sunny in Aberdeenshire right now. But and there are some planning permissions going through for solar farms in places that probably wouldn't have any significant agriculture output the way they are. And the offshore wind industry is taking off. Some of the stuff in the Murray Firth is on a massive scale. I mean, I've got a friend, Dick Winchester, who is an energy expert, and he talks about converting spare energy that the grid can't use into hydrogen. You can store the hydrogen and use that at a later date. He's a great fan of hydrogen, particularly for large vehicles, lorries, trains, you name it. Hydrogen would be better than plain simple electricity, and certainly better than diesel and other sources. There is so much more we can do, and I think we just need to get on and keep doing it as fast as we can.
And finally today, as Kenny alluded to earlier, with air-conditioned stadiums, it is the weekend at which the beginning of the World Cup begins in Qatar. And as Ecuador take the field against Qatar, questions continue over why the World Cup is there at all. As Scotland continue to maintain their international footballing competition boycott, has FIFA, many are asking, been a guiding light for human rights in Qatar, or is that an infantile rant or an Infantino rant? As the World Cup starts, will the football overshadow respect for human rights? And I'm going to turn to the person who has, in modern parlance, skin in the game. Hugh, you've got a team who are actually there. We don't. Is it? Should it be there at all?
No. Basically, it's really sad. It's the first time since 1958 Wales have been at a World Cup, and it should be such a joyous event. I've got lots of friends who've gone out to Qatar, who travel Wales to see Wales, wherever they were, whenever they're playing home and away. And the experiences they had in Euro 2016 in France were amazing, because a big part of any big tournament is, the experience, the socialising. Obviously the football is the main thing, but going there to support them. But it's more than that, and the fact that Qatar, how on earth they decided to put a World Cup, in a country where, because it was, remember, supposed to be in the summer, and they moved it because the air conditioning of the stadium stuff just wasn't sort of practical or viable. And it's really sad, because like I say, we should be out there enjoying ourselves. You can't even have a beer now unless you're in one of the luxury boxes where you can basically tank up on anything. But no, it shouldn't be. And what's sad as well is that Mark Drakeford, Labour government's First Minister, is out there. After Keir Starmer categorically said that no senior Labour politician would be going to Qatar, sort of Mark Drakeford has gone, and I heard him on LBC this morning. It's this thing about, we're going out there to try and change things. We're going to build links with museums in Qatar and look at sort of investments. But do we really want investment from a country like Qatar? A country that has sort of such issues when it comes to human rights. And thankfully, I think most people are just saying, well, go there to support the football team, by all means. But any other reason, we shouldn't be there. But no, it shouldn't be there, and it shouldn't have gone to Russia either. And I think both were awarded at the same time. And we're aware now of how those decisions might have been made.
And certainly, Kenny, we can laugh and joke about the purity of Scottish football and avoiding exposing it on a world stage. But the reality is, I suppose, within Scotland, I know in Aberdeenshire you now have Cove Rangers up who are making their way up towards where Aberdeen are at the moment. Football means a great deal to people. It's a community sport. It's one where there are very strong tentacles from the hubs into the community in the attempt, as a mass participation sport, to be a beacon for many youngsters, both in the male and the female game. But here it would look like the very pinnacle of the sport is very, very much rotten.
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole decision was false. I mean, I believe the stadiums in Qatar are all centred in an area that's roughly like the distance between Edinburgh and Glasgow. It just doesn't seem to make sense. I was a Scotland Travel Club member for about 25 years, and I was at the last World Cup that Scotland took part in 1998 in France. It was just joyous. I think at the various. Well, we only played 3 games, but there was between 15 and 20,000 Scots fans at each for each of those 3 games, and it was joyous, self-policed, and I wish Wales all the best. And the stadium works. Like you talk about Cove Rangers, Joe Jordan was in Aberdeen at the weekend for a Legends dinner, and he was at the Cove Rangers game yesterday. And Hugh might remember that Joe Jordan famously put Wales out of World Cup decider in Anfield in Liverpool.
We still haven't forgiven you for that. It still rankles to this day.
But
well, just of course to add into that, my football club is not as prestigious as Aberdeen, being an Ayrshireman, and it's no Kilmarnock. Of course, our manager took Scotland to a World Cup and came back in a little bit of a flurry of disgrace. So, our record's not particularly great. But Hugh, I was interested that the First Minister has taken the opportunity to go to Wales. And I think the defence that many have put up here is that we're going to go to Qatar in order to effect change, to create relationships, to influence, as we did in South Africa, South Korea. Didn't manage it very well in Russia. It seems to be very vacuous, does it not?
Well, especially when, yes, we are a country, but we're not self-governing. So what can Wales do? We can't say anything at the United Nations because we haven't got a seat at the table there. So it is it's posturing. Just see it for what it is. It's another jolly, and I'm afraid it happens a lot. I think with the Rugby World Cup that was in Japan, they go out there and say that it's all to do with inward investment, but we should be following these things up and saying, well, how much did we spend on sending these people out there, and what did they get back in return? And I think quite a few Labour ministers particularly have said they won't be going. And I think the culture minister, Dawn Bowden, who's a big football fan. She's the Senate member for Merthyr, but she's from Bristol. She's a big Bristol City fan, I think. So she said she's not going. But I think it's sad, but it also shows the divisions within the Labour Party, where the boss Keir Starmer says no senior Labour Labour politician is going to be in the World Cup, and how much more senior can you get than the First Minister of a Labour government within the UK? Indeed.
Well, that is all we have time for this week's Full Scottish. My start by thanking Kenny and Hugh for being my guests this afternoon. It's been a pleasure to have you both here and a very interesting conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who's donated and to everyone who's signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We have set ourselves a target of adding 10,000 new subscribers to enable us to employ staff to make more programmes. And on that, if we could ask those of you who are on social media, if you have enjoyed this afternoon or indeed any of our daily broadcasts, please do tweet us, send us out on Insta, like us on Facebook, wherever it is that you're able to help promote, please do. So on a day where we discovered that there is caution over weather and climate change, there is a possibility that the Chancellor has dodged a bullet, or has he dodged responsibilities? Gordon Brown is the voice of reason, and the sun apparently shines more often in Wales than it is in Scotland. It's goodbye from me here, and thank you very much for watching.